Hello, and welcome to the Empress podcast. I am your host, Jessica, known in the online space as Jess the Empress. I started this podcast to help you be present with yourself, cope with chaos, and simplify your life. I do this by combining psychology, behavioral science, and the tarot. I have a background in mental health, specifically a master's in clinical social work from USC, and I'm a professional tarot reader. So get ready to have a nurturing, creative, and empowering experience with me as we use practical magic. Hey, hi, hello. Welcome back to the pod. It's your girl, Jess. I'm excited to talk to you this month. I sat down at my desk and shuffled my cards and asked, what is the vibe for April? And I got the Four of Pentacles in the reverse position, and it's totally glitching online. Wait a second for the visuals, you guys. I was trying to show you, and it was like not showing up, but it's here now. So, Four of Pentacles in the reverse position. And I sat with this card for a few minutes, and what I kept focusing on was mental obstacles, these things that we have to overcome in order to get to these next phases of our life. And so that is what we're diving into for April, beyond the mind's barriers, overcoming mental obstacles. So let's dive in. I just want to talk about what I think is really interesting regarding mental obstacles because they feel so insurmountable sometimes. I've been there where just like the stories in my head are so loud. It's hard for me to like think about other things. But what I also know is that they primarily exist in our perception. It's like these, invisible walls that we experience as solid, but when we have the right approach to them, we can actually walk right through those walls. And that sounds like a really sweet visual, of just being able to walk through a wall. But I mean, there is work involved, and we'll talk about that. We'll also explore the most common mental barriers that people face when they're trying to take meaningful action. And when we're in pentacle energy, it can be action oriented. And so I think it's important to look at a bigger picture, not just the challenges that we face mentally, but the things that we want to do and how we're sometimes getting in our own way. But the obstacles themselves, like I said, they feel really powerful. And I'm going to give you some tips to move beyond them. I'll share some transformational stories that I witnessed, obviously, with myself. I love to talk about myself, but I also want to talk about my clients, like things that we've tackled, in one on one sessions. Because people come to me with a feeling of stuckness. And one of my responsibilities is to help people get unstuck and to help them feel capable of taking their next right actions. I see some common mental obstacles, and I was really thinking about the top like three or four. So we're going to dive into those. One of them is like the fear of judgment and the fear of failure. Huge. Perfectionism and like really ridiculously high standards would be number two. And then number three, I think, is overthinking. I think that it creates that decision analysis paralysis. And I also see a lot of self doubt. I see a lot of just like hesitation. I see imposter syndrome as well. And within that, there's a lot of all or nothing thinking. And also a lot of emotional reasoning. And an example of emotional reasoning can be I feel overwhelmed. So then that means that this is too much. And if you've been listening to me for a while, you'll know how we're going to break that down, how we're going to look at that critically. But the obstacles that you face, mentally, I want to say that they're not a character flaw because these are just parts of having a mind and having a complex mind as well. That you create some of your own obstacles, right? It's just due to having a brain. So when our brain is developing, it does things to keep us safe. and it doesn't want us to take risks. And so it comes up with these stories and these sentences that play out in our mind to prevent us from taking risks. So this is a safety mechanism, essentially, these stories that we're getting into, these mental obstacles. And when we can look at it that way, we have a lot more compassion with ourselves. And it also just gives us this ability to not be so over identified with the stories that are in our mind, because this is all happening subconsciously, right? You're not waking up in the morning and you're not saying, like, I'm choosing to get so overwhelmed right now. I'm choosing to engage in perfectionism right now. Like, you're not saying that. You're just probably noticing that you're feeling stuck, that you have a sense of anxiousness, that there's a lot of uncertainty that you're experiencing, and you don't really know like what the mental patterns are around some of those feelings. So that's just some of the things I see pretty frequently with my clients. I've experienced those things as well. Perfectionism, when I first started the podcast, I would labor way too long over certain things because I wanted it to be perfect. And even if I made a mistake, I would kind of beat myself up, but I was like, oh, wait a minute, I can just go back and edit this. And also, I know from experience now that with time comes mastery over a skill. So there's no need to be perfect if I'm not 5 or 10 years in. I don't need to have that weight of that pressure on my shoulders. So I had to give myself a more realistic perspective of what I was capable of in the moment, but also like what was possible. I believed that I could grow into being better at podcasting and sharing information, but that it would take some time. I definitely have those thoughts of fear of failure, fear of judgment. Hey there, coffee lovers. Are you tired of settling for boring coffee? I have a treat for you. Today's episode is brought to you by Heartwork Coffee Bar, your one-stop destination for exceptional coffee experiences. Whether you're a coffee connoisseur or just someone who appreciates a great cup of joe, Heartwork Coffee Bar is here to elevate your coffee game to new heights. At Heartwork Coffee Bar, they take pride in their craft because each batch is carefully roasted to perfection, ensuring that every sip is a symphony of flavor. From the rich and the robust to the light and fruity, they have a coffee blend for every palate. And here's the best part. For you amazing podcast listeners, Heartwork Coffee Bar is offering an exclusive 10% discount on your purchase. Just use the code Empress10 at checkout and you'll save big on your order. Why settle for ordinary when you can indulge in the extraordinary coffee from Heartwork Coffee Bar? Remember to use code Empress10 for that special 10% discount and treat yourself to the coffee experience that you deserve. Don't miss out on this fantastic offer. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thanks to Heartwork Coffee Bar for making today's episode possible. Now go grab your favorite mug, brew a fresh cup, and enjoy the podcast with the perfect companion, Heartwork Coffee Bar. Cheers. On a more larger level, what if I do all this work and like no one listens to the podcast episode? Like, I still have those thoughts. Now, the difference between the version I am today and the version I was at the beginning was that in the beginning, I really listened to those thoughts, and now they just show up and I'm like, well, I'm going to record this episode anyway. I just have like a different approach to managing that sort of thought, that sentence in my mind. And we don't get that if all we're doing is being blocked by our own obstacles. The second thing that it costs us is diminishing our own sense of agency. We really feel at the mercy of our circumstances a lot. And that can sometimes be true that we are at the mercy of our circumstances, but more often than not, we have more power than we realize. And like I said, our brains will tend to tell us that we don't have as much power as we really do. But then we also live reactively rather than living creatively. And I get like the yuck when I just even hear that sentence. When I wrote it down for the script, I was just like, oh, yeah, that doesn't even sound or feel good to me. I do not want to be reactive, only obviously when I need to for some type of like emergency. I absolutely want to live from a creative place. And it's very difficult to live from a creative place when we're not appropriately engaging with our obstacles, because our obstacles will be there. That is a part of life. But how we handle those obstacles makes all the difference in how we experience our life as a whole. And then we actually also lose trust in our capacity to change because staying stuck day in and day out, week in and week out, month in and month out, year in and year out, ugh, you know how like crazy that can drive you. And then it also just makes you feel like nothing you're doing is working. And so you lose trust in your ability to create the change that you want to experience. The third way that it's costing us is our disconnection from our values. Pentacles do represent values, our moral values, our ethical values, our spiritual values, our physical values, all those things. You can make a list of every single one of those. And you need to really understand like, where are you disconnected from those things? Take a closer look. You make choices based on fear rather than meaning. And meaning and purpose are interesting. I think in some ways, meaning and purpose has gotten confusing, especially if it's coming from a capitalist place, an unregulated capitalist place. But I do think that there is a need for us to have meaning and to have purpose. That purpose and that meaning for each individual is unique according to, your code of ethics and values. So it doesn't have to be anything grand or wild. It can be small and simple, and that is so beautiful. But regardless of what it is, if you don't understand really like the meaning you're making of your life, then everything is going to be based from fear, which is not the vibe. And then it also continues to create a gap between who you are and who you want to be. Because you're like me, you have a version of yourself that you want to be, and you can embody that, but it takes time to get there. And the longer that you sit and you just become a victim to your obstacles, the farther away you are from being that version of yourself that you really want to be. And then lastly, going back to the values, you start actually living according to everybody else's values and ethics and morals and everyone else's version of life. And I think that might be why the person in the Four of Pentacles does feel confused. They're trying to build a sense of inner stability, really understanding like, who am I in a world where everyone is telling me to be this and be that, and don't be this and don't be that. And as you explore that, as you create your own inner foundation, the things that trip us up are where we're just simply shaky and where we need to continue creating a stronger sense of meaning, right? And sense of trust within our own psyche, essentially. So let's keep going. I want to tell you guys a story. I'm going to tell you a story about a client of mine. Okay. So her name is Katie, and she had a really powerful vision for an art program, and she wanted it to be in her community. And she had like a ton of ideas. But when I actually saw her, I was like, oh, yeah, like give me your outline, like let's go over this and see how, like, what we need to start with really, and how much process you've made over or progress you've made over the last like year or whatever. And she was like, actually, no, like, oh, I've been sitting on this for like 3 years. And I was like, all right, let's talk about that first. And her biggest mental obstacle was actually perfectionism. So once we like kind of got into the stories that she had in her mind, she was like basically thinking it needed to be this like huge thing that would be like nationwide, or like groundbreaking. I don't even think groundbreaking was the term that she used, but it was essentially like it needed to be like this wild, crazy big thing. And I was like, okay, I mean, but does it? Like, does it? Like I'm just asking, like, does it? And eventually she was like, actually, no, it doesn't. And then she was also saying, like, well, like, what if I try to do these things and like nobody shows up, right? And I'm like, I've been there. I know about that. But it's like, what's missing from the world right now is you showing up to have this art program. Like, people want this art program. They just don't know that they want it because they're not seeing you offering it. So you have to show up so that people can say yes. And so, um, she was disconnected from like her power, really, her purpose and her capability to do these things, and to do them in a way that wasn't perfect, to do them in a way that was kind of messy. But that's okay, because when we give ourselves permission to be messy, to learn as we go, to try and fail, then we actually get stuff done. We actually get stuff done instead of thinking, I can only do this and the only way has to be the perfect way. And emotional reasoning, oh my gosh, I think that's probably one of the biggest things that shows up in my life, especially around my feelings of like overwhelm and anxiety. Those stories are pretty strong, but it's still something that I'm aware of that's happening and then I can continue to take action. So, I mean, this whole journey is not about perfection, it's just about knowing yourself better so that you don't stay tripped up and disoriented for longer than necessary, longer than you have, in the past. And before we talk about the solutions to mental obstacles, we're going to talk about what these obstacles are actually costing us. I think it's so important to really understand what's happening when you're engaging with these mental obstacles in an unproductive way. Okay. The first thing is lost potential. And these skills that you want to develop, they actually never get developed because you're too busy doing other things and doubting yourself than actually taking action. Connections with other people are not made. The contributions that you have to the world, they're not ever offered. And joy is never really experienced. And we actually kind of see this in the Four of Pentacles tarot card. The person is separated from their community. They are sitting alone in the center of the card, and behind them is a city with a wall. And so you can guess that this person is feeling a little bit disconnected, is feeling a little bit isolated. The expression on the person's face in the Four of Pentacles tends to be pretty stoic, kind of reflecting this idea that they're not really connected to a sense of purpose or meaning or even joy in the moment. And what's interesting is that pentacles are things that we value. These can be things like money, they can be material goods, but they can also be our mind. They can also be our physical body, the thing, the vessel, or whatever you want to call it, that like holds our mind. And this is where our ideas come from. And that's where our contributions come from our ideas. The skills, like we have to get our hands dirty. We have to exercise our minds. It's a very tactile, tangible experience, right? That skill development. If any of this is resonating, by the way, please like, please share, please comment wherever that you are finding me. I would love to chat with you to know how things are going for you. If you're learning anything, if you're nodding your head, just chat with me. But let's move into the four pillars for obstacle navigation. Okay. We're going to talk about overcoming the mental obstacles because that's why you're here. You're here to learn new things. Okay. Step one, compassionate awareness. Before you can move a mental obstacle, you actually have to recognize it's there and you have to recognize it without judgment. At first, we might be a little judgy, and that's okay. But the more you can quiet the judge, the more into a state of compassion you are. I have a client of mine, she's a writer, and so she faces a lot of like chronic procrastination. And this is very common. It's common even sometimes for me when I'm writing, a script, I'll like procrastinate a little bit, which is fine. And we all do it. No judgment, right? That's the whole point. But when she and I first started talking about the procrastination, she would get really hard on herself. She'd be really hard on herself by saying things like, I just like don't have any discipline. I can never get my act together. And I was like, whoa, girl, whoa. Let's shift the narrative. Okay. What happens before you try writing? Like, what's going on there in your mind? What sensations and feelings are you noticing? So she started to practice this compassionate awareness and then realized that she had some old thinking patterns, especially around, shocker, needing to be perfect on a first draft. And I was like, oh man, I've been there too. Like, I would try to get I would even try to get like a perfect outline, which is like so goofy. And this goes back actually to to like grad school level writing which was intense for me, but good. However, the habit of like always needing to have a perfect first draft did die in grad school and then resurfaced. It was reborn when I got into podcast writing. And so I've learned how to shake that off because it is an old pattern and it's okay if old patterns arise, as long as we're not like playing into them time and again, like we're good. So, anyway, with her, she was able to show up for her variety of drafts as well without judgment, with less judgment. And so the obstacle really for her, the perfectionism, it became something that she could work with rather than against, because what she was doing was keeping in mind that the perfectionism just wanted to do a good job. And so the more that she affirmed that she was going to do a good job and that that would happen in the end, not necessarily the beginning, the easier things got. I've applied that same thing to myself when I'm doing drafts of anything. It doesn't have to be good now, it'll be good later. That's the whole point of a draft. And also, it's kind of funny, right? Like when we say these things out loud, when we like talk ourselves through our own process, we just realize how silly things are sometimes. And that's great because then we actually get to experience some joy and some laughter and some lighthearted energy, even in the midst of, a mental challenge, even in the midst of a challenging mental moment. So, one of the big reminders here is that you're not your thoughts. Thoughts are just sentences in your mind. And you can practice saying, I notice that I'm thinking, and then state your sentence, or I notice the thoughts in my mind are, and then state them out loud or write them. This way, you create some separation between the you that is whole and observing the mind. This is sort of a mindfulness trick. So, it's very, very helpful. But number two is realistic reframing. So I know I spoke about this really briefly with like how I had to, touch grass and come down to earth with my own perfectionism habits. But mental obstacles often involve distorted thinking and that needs some gentle correction. I'm just going to use a story that I wrote. This has nothing to do with a client, but we'll just jump in. Mia wanted to start a business, but she was paralyzed by catastrophic thinking. In her mind, anything less than immediate success was a total failure, bankruptcy, and humiliation. So she worked on developing what philosophers call the perspective hindsight, which is the ability to look back from an imagined future at multiple possible outcomes. This practice helped her see that even if her business struggled, she had resources, skills, and support that would prevent a true catastrophe. This reframing didn't eliminate uncertainty, but it did transform her from being in a paralyzed state to a manageable state. I have been through similar experiences. One of them specifically was when I had to find housing while I was going through the divorce process and in grad school at the same time in a state that I knew nobody. I had no friends established yet. And it was pretty crazy. I also had to transform from paralyzing to having a manageable state. And the biggest pieces that stick out to me here within this story are remembering, like, yeah, I'm actually going to struggle. So it's actually okay. Let me just dive into the fact that, like, that's what's going to happen, but I have resources, I have skills, I have support. Even if my support wasn't physical, I had it, emotionally from friends that were back in my home state that I grew up in. And that was good enough. It was good enough to get me through. Things were then manageable. But it's just really important to navigate, these mental obstacles, that we have a realistic reframing. And a lot of the times we're not hopeless. A lot of the times it's not really like the worst case scenario playing out. There are options. And the way that I did this, I actually remember this exercise from my therapist. I would write out my worst case scenario and then I would write out my best case scenario. So that's like um that future version of me that's like everything's working out perfectly kind of thing, which is fine, but you have to take that a step further because it's not life doesn't usually end up being like one or the other. It's like somewhere in between. So, what's the most likely scenario? That was the third part of the exercise. And I also had to base the most likely scenario on evidence. I could not base it on emotion. That was really specific about what I had to do within that homework assignment. And it was really helpful because when you're looking for evidence, you're showing your mind that there's more possible than what you might know. And that evidence took me time to gather. I had to research online, I had to reach out to people, I had to wait to hear back. Like that evidence building took time, but it was worth it because it helped me manage my emotions and manage my mind in a way that allowed me to take action and not become paralyzed. So, with all the scenarios, the worst case, the best case, the most likely case, you want to write the resources that you would need to handle it. And then you want to write about what you would learn from that situation and how you might grow. The resources can be lots of different resources. They can include people, they can include locations, they can include money. So, really expand your thinking here. Like, who would be supporting you? Where would you have to go to find that support? Um, get really granular with the details. But again, this is a great, great way to help yourself navigate some of those mental catastrophes that we all make in our mind, because the whole point of it is supposed to be expanding your mindset from that all or nothing black and white thinking of like worst case scenario, best case scenario, both of which are typically pretty delusional. Okay, we've made it to step number three. This is committed micro steps. Large obstacles require small, consistent action to overcome the obstacle. I love small, consistent action because it's doable. It makes me feel good. And I don't know, I just like being in that space of like capable. Let's jump into a story. Alex suffered from profound decision paralysis. Every choice felt overwhelming, leading to months of inaction on important life decisions. He developed a micro step approach, breaking down each decision into small possible actions. So instead of choose a career path, he wrote, research 3 job descriptions that sound interesting. Each completed micro step built momentum and confidence. And 6 months later, Alex had progressed more than he had before in the last 6 months because instead of having an overwhelming task to do, which was, find a job, choose a career, he was able to actually take steps, even though he wasn't sure of the answers. And that's great. Those obstacles slowly started to disappear. So, an actionable practice that you can take is a micro step ladder. Choose an action that's obviously aligned with you that you believe is blocked by a mental obstacle. And then break that down into 10 steps and make the steps really, really small. Schedule the first step. I think it's better to put something like that on your calendar with like a reminder, just so you have, some accountability there. And then create a physical representation of that progress. What I like is a checklist. That's my visual tracker. But I also like to have sticky notes, and something about like being able to tear off a sticky note and like crumple it up and throw it away feels really good. Once I've completed that step, I'll pull it off and throw it away. I don't know. I like the way that feels. I like the way it looks and it works for me. So whatever works for you, do it. And then celebrate every step after you finish it. The celebration doesn't have to be wild and crazy, but if you want to ball out, I mean, go ahead. It's your budget, do your thing. But sometimes just a small celebration is what you need to reinforce your ability to take action, to feel good for the action that you've taken, and to reinforce that connection. Because sometimes we believe we can only celebrate when there's a good outcome. And I think we're missing the point of celebrating ourselves for the action that we're taking. And I really hope that you get to reinforce that in a more beautiful way, because it is about the action itself and not about perfect action or perfect outcome. And then step 4 is embodied integration. So, mental obstacles, they don't just live in our thoughts, they live in our physical experience. Like I mentioned, you might notice that you're feeling anxious, that you're feeling overwhelmed or stuck, but you don't have an awareness yet of your mental stories. So, you can kind of clock when you're in an overwhelmed state based on how you're feeling. And that can help you. Let's jump into a story about Elena. She struggled with imposter syndrome, and it created a really intense anxiety whenever she had to speak in professional settings. Cognitive approaches, they did help her, but her breakthrough came when she incorporated embodiment practices. And she discovered that physical stances and breathing patterns actually shifted her nervous system state. And that helped her create a stronger foundation of inner safety and self trust that she could engage from more fully and in a more present way. So, over time, this integration of mind body connection allowed her to access her capabilities even when those imposter thoughts arose. So, what's so important to take away from this, and kind of like I said at the beginning, we're all still going to have those thoughts of whatever the nonsense stories are. I still have them. It's all okay, but I'm not stuck anymore. I'm not disorganized anymore. I can take action even with those thoughts in my mind. And I think this is just like one of the things that people miss. They imagine that in order to be fully embodied, you're no longer having those thoughts. No, you are, but you're just not stuck or paralyzed by them. And with the Four of Pentacles in the reverse position, the number four itself is about a foundation. And from that place, that's why I mentioned being able to build a foundation that is strong, that's based on our values and our morals and our ethics, the things that make us an individual. When we're so busy taking in everybody else's stuff, we're not living from a place of us. We're living from a place of everyone's telling us who to be. And so that's often why we can feel like an imposter because there's so much noise around what makes us right or wrong or good or bad or valid or not valid or whatever. And yeah, it's just an interesting place to be. So let's talk about some actionable steps that you can use for this grounding protocol. When you're facing a mental obstacle, just pause, put your feet on the ground and take some slow, deep breaths. And make sure that your exhale is longer than your inhale. That's what helps regulate and balance that nervous system to a more calm state. You can also dive into the five senses rule, which is talking about five things that you see, four things that you hear, three things that you smell, one thing or two things that you taste, and one thing that you're touching or something. They don't have to be in that order, whatever. And most people don't even make it all the way down to like the last one because by the time you get around there, you've already started to feel more grounded. So the five senses exercise is a great one. I do it all the time, especially when like I'm noticing a lot of anxiety in my body. I'll just start looking around the room and I'll just start talking about like, oh, outside my window, like I see a lemon tree, I see blue sky, I see white clouds, I see a red bucket, I see, and sometimes like you can just keep doing that. If I do listening for myself right now, I hear some birds, I hear some crickets, I hear some traffic, some trucks going down the street. So like you're getting the idea, right, of how to go through this practice. But from this grounded state, then you shift into taking an action. And I want you to notice how physical presence changes your relationship to mental obstacles. And that's been a huge game changer for me, is really just being able to integrate my confidence in the now and transform my actions. Instead of taking reactive steps, I'm taking more bold and authentic, aligned action. And let's wrap up with some integration conversation. These four pillars, I'm going to recap them: compassionate awareness, realistic reframing, committed micro steps, and embodied integration. And they all support each other, which is great. Like if you're finding yourself one of them not working, just try a different one, try things on and see what happens. Most importantly, it's just a framework. It's not about eliminating obstacles. It really is about just changing your relationship with obstacles so that you're feeling more empowered, not that they have power over you. Mental obstacles, it's a part of being a human. The goal is never to like act like you're going to avoid fear or doubt or hesitation. It's to develop your capacity to handle them. So as we close out for today, I want to leave you with this. Behind every mental obstacle is a value or desire that deeply matters to you. We only experience obstacles around things that we actually care about. Your fear of failure exists because success matters to you. Your decision paralysis exists because you want to make meaningful choices. See your obstacles not as your enemy, but as your signposts pointing towards what matters most. And remember that every single person you admire, every leader, every artist, every game changer, they have all also faced their own mental barriers. What distinguishes them is not the absence of obstacles, but it is their willingness to develop practices for moving through them. So pick a practice from today's episode and start with that. Notice what shifts. Remember, the substantial changes through consistent small actions happen over time, not from these crazy dramatic breakthroughs. Your capacity to move beyond mental obstacles grows each time that you observe your thoughts with compassion, expand your perspective beyond fear based thinking, take one step despite discomfort, and ground yourself in your physical experience. I hope these tips give you a lot of support as you navigate through the month of April. The Four of Pentacles in the reverse position is really just encouraging us to become more of who we are, to clear out the things that do not help us grow, and to stand in a firm and strong foundation of ourselves. I love you, and I'll talk to you next time. Okay, bye. I want to ask you to rate and review my podcast. Giving me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts would mean the world to me. I love knowing who's listening and what everyone is getting from the episode, so please take a moment of your time to share your thoughts, and I look forward to reading your reviews soon.